$10,000 to remain available until September 30th, 2015.
Madam Chair.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I ask unanimous consent that the bill through page 71, line 14 be considered as read, printed in the record, and open to amendment at any point.
Is there objection to the gentleman's request? Without objection, so ordered. Are there any amendments to that section? The clerk will read.
Page 71, line 15, section 530. 30 days after the date on which the President determines to declare a major disaster, the Administrator shall publish on the website a report regarding that decision. Section 531. Any official that is required to report to the committees may not delegate such authority unless specifically authorized herein. Section 532. Section 550B of the Department of Homeland Security is further amended by striking on October 4, 2013 and inserting on October 4, 2014. Section 533. None of the funds appropriated.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Madam Chairwoman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Moran of Virginia and Section 533, amend paragraph 2 to read as follows. 2. As transferred to the United States Naval Station, Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, by the Department of Defense after December 31, 2005.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I reserve a point of order on the gentleman's
amendment. A point of order is reserved. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Section 533 would prohibit any funds being used for the transfer, release, or assistance in the transfer or release of any Guantanamo detainee housed in Cuba on or after June of 2009. My amendment would change that date to December 31st, 2005. Now, in 2006, people who were truly the worst of the worst, those detainees who were housed in CIA black sites, were transferred to Guantanamo. Now, prior to 2006, Guantanamo was populated with detainees who were simply not as deserving of indefinite detention as this latter group, in my view, is. 86% of the people of the first group, prior to 2005, were arrested in exchange for a bounty. The vast majority never committed an act of violence against the United States or any of its allies. About 5% may have been affiliated with al-Qaeda. Now, Madam Chairwoman, it seems to me that it's time that we clarified the definition of who was at Guantanamo. I listened very closely to my good friends yesterday, including Mr. Wolf, who cited Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in defining who was at Guantanamo. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is one of those worst of the worst. I don't care what you do to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. As far as I'm concerned, from everything I know, he deserves whatever happens to him. But we're not talking about him if this amendment were to pass. We're talking about people who were brought there initially. More than half were already released of the 779 by the Bush administration. 86 more have been already cleared for release. Now, Madam Chairwoman, fact is we're spending $150 million a year to house these folks. About 150 of them are people that were brought there before 2005. And we've authorized up to $500 million to be spent to further modernize the facilities so that we can keep them indefinitely. It's expensive. We're spending $1 million per detainee now, and then we would be talking, if we spent that $500 million more, for indefinite detention. And the problem with that, in addition to the money, is the national security issue. Because Guantanamo is a recruiting tool and a rallying cry for the enemy. It's not the only thing they cite, but invariably it's one of the principal things they cite, and why the United States is not the country that it truly is. They suggest that we are not good to our word, that we don't believe in the very principles of our jurisprudence system, that people are innocent until they've been proven guilty, that they ought to be charged with crimes, that we don't believe in indefinite detention. That's what other countries do. We don't do that. We give people a fair trial. But the reason we have Guantanamo is that this was set up to be above the law. It's extrajudicial. The rules don't apply. And the rest of the world looks at this, and it undermines our credibility and our security as a nation. That, Madam Chairwoman, is exactly why we should distinguish. The worst of the worst, keep them there. Keep them in some kind of isolated structure. But you sure don't have to spend $500 million for 12 to 15 people. But those other 150, of whom many of them are now on a hunger strike, the majority are on a hunger strike, because they believe there's no hope. There's nothing to live for. They're going to be there forever. And in fact, more than 30 of them, 37 to be exact, are being forcibly tube-fed. This was in another nation. We'd be on the floor. Mr. Wolf would be on the floor objecting to this.
The gentleman's time
That's why this amendment
expired.
should pass, Madam Chairwoman.
For purpose, does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I rise to withdraw my point of order and rise in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized. The reservation is withdrawn, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in opposition to the amendment simply because I don't know the impact of security, on security of this amendment. Who would be released? Where would these prisoners be relocated? And where would they be released to? To Yemen? To the United States? I simply don't know by reading this amendment. It's clear that if these individuals were released to Yemen, they would not likely remain in custody for very long and would likely rejoin the fight. At the outset of the President's first term, an executive order declared the intention to close Guantanamo Bay and bring the detainees to the United States. That proposal was rejected by this Congress, and prohibitions on transferring detainees to the U.S. were enacted by overwhelming bipartisan majorities. As my colleague and friend, Mr. Wolf, just discussed yesterday during consideration of the Milcon bill, this amendment could result in very dangerous outcomes. 779 people were detained in the first few years, and at this time it is unknown how many could potentially be released as an effect of this amendment. As you know, several men who have been released from Guantanamo have gone back into the battlefield and killed Americans. We also know that having these dangerous individuals detained and tried in the United States dramatically impacts the facilities and localities where they're located. You must remember that the violent nature of some of these individuals and the social impact on having these people in our neighborhoods. I simply cannot support this amendment. It has a high monetary and social costs and could potentially endanger our communities. In fact, a few years ago, it was discussed about releasing some of these detainees, 5 up in New York City, and that was rejected very, very strongly by both Republicans and Democrats. Any proposal that results in these detainees being sent to the United States is simply the wrong policy. I urge my colleagues to reject the gentleman's amendment, and I yield back at this time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Madam Chairman, I ask to strike the last words.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chairman, I rise in support of my colleague Mr. Moran's amendment. The fact is that Section 533 of this bill, which his amendment amends, that section has no place in this bill in the first place. This doesn't simply doesn't belong in the Homeland Security bill. If it belongs in any bill, it would be the Commerce Justice bill. But as a political gesture for years now, we've had this amendment or something very much like it added to a number of appropriations bills. What Mr. Moran has done tonight, though, is interesting. He has not proposed that the section be removed. He has simply amended it. He's amended it, I think, in a sensible way. He would limit the prohibition of the transfer of detainees to those demonstrably dangerous people who were transferred after 2005. And that should remove most of the objections people have made to the elimination of this prohibition entirely. It seems that the people who have pushed, the colleagues who have pushed this amendment year after year and bill after bill, they don't apparently have very strong concerns about indefinite detention and the kind of stain that this represents on this country. They also seem to think that when detainees are going to be brought to trial, that the way to do it is military commissions at Guantanamo. Seem to think that's the only possible form of justice for these detainees. Well, the reality is that military commissions have a very spotty record at best, while our criminal courts have a long and successful record of prosecuting terrorists. Why would we want to eliminate that option? Why would we want to deny that option to the President? I think the reasoning of the proponents of this provision both denigrates our judicial system and actually exalts these detainees to a status they don't deserve in the eyes of the world. So if I had my way, this section would not be in the bill in the first place. But since it is, I think our colleague has made a very sensible proposal that we should consider very favorably. And I hope that colleagues will do just that. And I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Direct Requisite number
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I rise in opposition to the amendment. And I want to, again, to begin, I don't believe it's fair to say that had we closed down Guantanamo Bay, bin Laden would not have done what he had done. Bin Laden was active and al-Qaeda was active in a 1993 bombing at the World Trade Center. That was before the Guantanamo Bay. They were involved in the bombing of the American embassy in Tanzania and Nairobi. That was before. And I don't believe that al-Qaeda and al-Shabaab and all these are waiting to see, well, when President Obama closes down Guantanamo Bay, we're going to kind of get off the field. It's going to be over. And I just don't think that has any impact. Secondly, the transferees, according to a political article, FBI Director Robert Mueller stated the transfer of detainees to local jails could affect or infect other prisoners or have the capability of affecting events outside the prison system. I agree with Director Mueller. I think Director Mueller has done a great job. On the Misali case, if the gentleman remembers, Misali was in Alexandria for 4 years, and it tied up Alexandria. And to bring some of these people and to try them here creates a lot of problems. The other issue, though, 15% at least, and this is an old figure, it could be higher, it could be a little bit lower, but at least 15% of the terrorism recidivism rate of released detainees that were released back to Yemen and places like that. It is not unheard of to have, as you release some, and some were released under the Bush administration, went back on the field and killed our men and women. And so to release these, certainly you would never do this in an appropriation bill. You would have extensive hearings in and out. You would call the FBI, ask what the ramifications is. You would call the CIA to ask them what the ramifications. You would ask Homeland Security to ask what the ramifications. So for all these issues, and I won't take up any more time because we covered it last night, I think this is a bad amendment, and I urge its defeat. And yield back the balance.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Madam Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I think this is a very important debate. I remind my colleague from Virginia that I was on the Board of Supervisors in Fairfax County during the Karzai trial, and most certainly it was a difficult time, but we handled professionally that trial. He was tried fairly, convicted, and executed in the Commonwealth of Virginia. It is not beyond our reach to be able to handle these difficult cases. Madam Chairman, I believe that this is a very important debate. I believe the author needs to be heard in the exposition of this argument, and I'm pleased now to yield to Mr. Moran of Virginia.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I thank my very good friend from Virginia. And I would like to address a few points that my other very good friend from Virginia made. First of all, with regard to the Massari case that was tried in Alexandria.
Ben?
Yes. I need to address the chairwoman.
The gentleman from Virginia
Needs to stand.
needs to
Yes.
remain on his feet.
Thank you
The
very much,
gentleman is
Madam Chairwoman.
continued.
Madam Chairwoman, the case that my good friend from Virginia referred to is actually a case in point. As Mr. Connolly pointed out, the American jurisprudence system worked. He was tried, and he was convicted, and he was executed. And in fact, no convictions have been achieved with these military commissions. 2 guilty verdicts, but they were overturned.
Would the gentleman yield one?
The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, controls
Would the gentleman
time.
yield? If it would, Miss Sally was picked up here in the United States.
If the gentleman would suspend, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, controls the time.
If the gentleman would yield,
I would yield to my friend from
okay.
Virginia.
Miss Sally
gentleman
was
is recognized.
picked up here in the United States. He was not picked up on the battlefield in Afghanistan or someplace like that. So they were totally separate type issues.
Well,
I
if
yield
they
back.
were-
Thank you, gentlemen, for.
I would say the gentleman, if they were totally separate, then I don't know why he brought that issue into this debate, if they were totally separate. The fact is, there is a lesson, and I want to explain what that lesson is, because our American jurisprudence system worked. He was convicted in a U.S. court. And in fact, before he was executed, there was a description of this person. I don't want to call him a gentleman. He was crying uncontrollably. And apparently the reason was that all the conceptions that he had proved to be misconceptions. He had been screaming about how bad the United States was, how unfair the trial was. And then he realized he was wrong. Now, it's too late for him to realize that, but the American jurisprudence system worked. And in fact, we have tried more than 1,000 terrorists in the United States. We are currently holding 373 people convicted of terrorism in 98 facilities across the country. There are 6 Department of Defense facilities where detainees could be held in the United States, and they're only at 48% capacity. There are 98 Justice Department facilities, as the gentleman well knows, and one is in Alexandria, where Guantanamo detainees could be held in the United States. I just want to show the rest of the world that our justice system works, that it's what defines us as a nation and as a people. Guantanamo doesn't define us. It's just the opposite of what we believe in, what we profess to believe in. That's the problem. Now, nobody suggested that 9/11 happened because of Guantanamo. We know our history. We know when Guantanamo was established. But the fact is, and we could cite any number of situations where our enemy cites Guantanamo as a reason for these young, impressionable men to join the forces of al-Qaeda, because they want to suggest that we really are not who we say we are. This amendment would let us be who we are. Let the president close this facility that never should have been established in the first place. The Bush administration recognized that when it released more than half of the detainees, 779 of them, turned in for bounties. in Afghanistan and Pakistan. That's not the way we arrest people. They release them. And the majority of the people at Guantanamo today, they've been cleared for release. They ought to be released, or they ought to be tried. And as far as the worst of the worst, do what you want with them. But you don't have to spend $500 million to upgrade the facilities at Guantanamo so that you can house people indefinitely. That's not who we are. That's why this amendment should pass.
Mr. Connolly's time has expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Madam Chairwoman.
The agreement is not agreed to. The gentleman is recognized.
I would request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote having been requested pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia will be postponed. The clerk will read.
Page 73, line 9, Section 534. None of the funds may be used for first-class travel by the employees of agencies funded by this Act.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania seeks recognition for what purpose?
Yeah, Madam Chair, I ask unanimous consent that the bill through page 88, line 16, be considered as read, printed in the record, and open to amendment at any point.
Is there objection to the gentleman's request? Hearing no objection, request is approved. The clerk will read. Are there any amendments to that section?
Madam Chairman.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized. For what purpose? No.
I think I have to wait.
The clerk will read.
Page 88, line 17, Section 561. None of the funds may be used to establish or otherwise impose a border crossing fee for pedestrians along the southern border or the northern border. Section 562, none of the funds may be used to eliminate a program, project, or activity as proposed in the President's budget request. Section 563, none of the funds may be used to approve a classification petition.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Madam Chairman, now I make a point of order against Section 563 of this bill. The section violates Clause 2 of Rule 11, which prohibits legislative language in a general appropriations bill.
Does any member wish to be heard on the point of order? Does any member wish to be heard on the gentleman's point of order? The chair is prepared to rule. The gentleman from Virginia makes a point of order that Section 563 proposes to change existing law in violation of Clause 2B of Rule 21. As recorded in Dechler's Precedents, Volume 8, Chapter 26, Section 52, even though a limitation might refrain from explicitly assigning new duties to officers of the government, if it implicitly requires them to make judgments and determinations not otherwise required of them by law, then it assumes the character of legislation and is subject to a point of order under Clause 2 of Rule 21. The proponent of a provision assumes the burden of establishing that any duties imposed by the provision are already required by law. The limitation proposed in Section 563 declines to fund specified classification petitions filed by or for citizens or nationals of Brazil. As the chair understands it, current law does not require the Department of Homeland Security to determine the citizenship or nationality of persons for whom classification petitions are filed. Compliance with Section 563 would require that relevant federal officials receiving funds in this Act to make a determination regarding national or citizenship of certain persons. The proponent of this provision has not carried the burden of proving that the relevant federal officials are presently charged with making this determination. On these premises, the Chair concludes that the section proposes to change existing law. Accordingly, the point of order is sustained. Section 563 is stricken from the bill.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Madam Chairman,
For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon seek recognition?
move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We're debating legislation that's critical to the safety of all Americans. But one threat that often gets underplayed, but which has been catapulted into the news recently, is natural disaster. 75% of Americans live in areas that are at risk for some type of disaster, whether flood, fire, hurricane, tornado, landslide, or earthquake. The past 2 years, the United States experienced 25 severe extreme weather events that caused over 1,100 fatalities, $188 billion in damages, far more than all the domestic acts of terror in the last decade. This legislation spends $6.2 billion on disaster relief, $5.6 billion of which is emergency spending, not subject to discretionary caps. I strongly support the role of the federal government in disaster response, recovery, and prevention. But the costs of disaster relief are staggering and they are growing, whether due to stronger, more frequent storms, climate change, increased development in harm's way, or an increase in disaster declarations. To put these costs into perspective, Congress started in 2013 by passing the American Taxpayer Relief Act of 2012, which generated $600 billion over 10 years in new revenue. 2 weeks later, we passed the Superstorm Sandy supplemental totaling $60 billion, and total all of that first year's revenue under that proposal. In times of budget austerity, Congress should have a full understanding of how much money taxpayers are spending on disaster relief, recovery, and mitigation. Unfortunately, these expenditures are far from transparent. There are wildly varying estimates of what these costs may be. The OMB recently estimated the federal government spent an average of $11.5 billion per year from 2001 to 2011, but it included only funding specifically related to the Stafford Act and excluded the highest and lowest spending years, including $37 billion for Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. Another analysis found we spent $136 billion from fiscal year 2011 to 2013 on disaster relief, about $45 billion a year, and nearly $400 per household per year on average. A 2005 study referenced a cost of $1 billion per week from emergency response, public and private property damages, and business disruption, a calculation made before Hurricane Katrina. An accurate and comprehensive accounting of federal disaster spending, as well as an estimate of future needs, will enable this Congress and future Congresses to make better decisions about how much to budget for these events and how to prioritize scarce federal dollars. Accurate information would also inform the ongoing conversation about ways to reduce this spending in the first place. Spending more money up front on mitigation and community resilience can reduce the need for disaster relief expenditures. The Multi-Hazard Mitigation Council, in a congressionally mandated study, documented that $1 for mitigation saves society an average of $4 in avoided disaster costs. Now, I appreciate the language that the chair and ranking member and their committee in this legislation requiring FEMA to submit an expenditure plan detailing the use of funds for disaster readiness and support. I think it's an important step forward, but frankly, I think the reporting requirement may be too narrow. I would request that the chairman and ranking member would work with me as this legislation moves to conference to expand the scope of the reporting requirement. We need FEMA to look comprehensively at federal spending on disaster, recovery, preparedness, and yes, possibly prevention. Look at spending on all federal programs, agencies, and departments responding to and preparing for storms, flooding, fires, earthquake, drought, and other disasters. FEMA should examine the reasons behind the rising costs and provide recommendations that may mitigate them going forward. The inherent unpredictability of natural disasters makes exact congressional budgeting in this area very difficult, and my heart goes out to the committee and your staff. But it's clear disaster relief will continue to strain federal budgets, particularly if the recent bout of extreme weather continues. The first step towards finding savings will be to have an accurate accounting of these expenditures. We should take that step now in this legislation, and I would look forward to working with the committee if you are so inclined. And I would yield back.
Does the gentleman
gentleman's
yield?
time has expired.
I would be happy to yield.
The gentleman's
I
time
move to
has...
strike the last word.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to thank the gentleman for yielding, and I appreciate your concern and agree with you that this is a topic of high concern to everyone. As you saw, our bill contains numerous oversight requirements to address these issues. I look forward to working with the gentleman as the bill moves through the process to ensure that Congress has the most comprehensive information possible on the costs associated with natural disasters, and I agree if there is a way to mitigate, we should look into that. And so I look forward to working with you, and I yield back to the gentleman. Or I'll yield to my colleague if I have the authority to.
The gentleman from Texas controls the time.
I yield to my colleague, Mr. Price.
The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I want to add my thanks to our colleague from Oregon for what he has said here tonight. This area of disaster relief funding is one that has challenged us for a long time, getting accurate predictions and estimates of the needs from Democratic and Republican administrations, and dealing with this under budget pressures here in this body. But the baseline for any of this has got to be honest budgeting, realistic assessments, and we need to work on this going forward. And so I'm interested in what the gentleman from Oregon says about the ideas that he has that might help us strengthen this. Both the accurate accounting of expenditures for past disasters and also a better understanding of the mitigation potential. I think both of those are important areas for exploration, and I certainly will work with the chairman and with him in exploring this going forward. I thank the gentleman for
reclaiming my
yielding.
time, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Clerk will read.
Page 89, line 9, section 564. None of the funds shall be available to pay for an abortion except where the life of the mother would be endangered. Section 565. None of the funds shall be used to require any person to perform any abortion. Section 566. Nothing in the preceding section shall remove the obligation of the Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security to provide escort services necessary for female detainee to receive such service outside the detention facility. Section 567. The Secretary shall submit to Congress a comprehensive report on purchase and usage of ammunition by the Department. Rescissions. Section 568. Of the funds appropriated to the Department, funds are hereby rescinded from accounts and programs in the specified amounts. Rescission. Section 569. From the unobligated balances made available in the Department of the Treasury Forfeiture Fund, $100 million shall be permanently rescinded. Spending reduction account, Section 570. The amount by which the applicable allocation of new budget authority made by the Committee on Appropriations is $0.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I'd like to thank Chairman Carter and Ranking Member Price on behalf of the residents of our region, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut and the East Coast. Mention was made of a of disasters, and I want to thank the chair and all the committee members, and certainly the big chair, Chairman Rogers, but particularly the Homeland Security Appropriations Committee for their working with us on behalf of our residents who continue to suffer. I just want to take this opportunity to thank you, to show our appreciation. There's some tough decisions that had to be made, and we're especially grateful to the staff of both sides of the aisle that worked with us to make life a little more bearable for our residents. And since this is the first appropriations bill since Hurricane Sandy, I just want to express my appreciation. And also, Madam Chairman, I come from a 9/11 state, and this committee is very important to urban areas, and in this bill are protections, greater protections for the residents of major cities and metropolitan areas. I'd also like to express my appreciation to Chairman Carter and Mr. Price for making sure that different grants are there for first responders to, if there are man-made disasters or any type of disasters, the funds are there. So I yield back and appreciate the opportunity.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I rise to invite the chairman, the distinguished chairman of the committee, and the ranking member to engage in a colloquy. As a member who represents a large technology community in Northern Virginia, I share Chairman Carter and Ranking Member Price's urgency for cultivating a robust cyber workforce, and I appreciate the committee's thoughtful report language identifying this as a Homeland Security priority with specific actions for the Department to pursue so that it can lead by example. I look forward to working with them and their staffs in this vital initiative, and with that, I would ask unanimous consent that the remainder of our colloquy be entered into the record at this point.
Objection, so ordered.
I yield back.
The remainder of his time. Purposes of
Strike
gentleman
last
from
word.
Texas.
I thank the gentleman from
Before
Virginia.
the gentleman begins, the gentleman may not enter a colloquy into the record. The gentleman from Texas.
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chairman, I thank the gentleman from Virginia and assure him that we will continue to work together on this issue. Yield back.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Virginia seek recognition.
Madam Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I rise to invite Chairman Carter to engage in a colloquy. Chairman Carter and Ranking Member Price have done a lot of good work to craft this bill in a bipartisan fashion that strengthens our ability to provide for the safety and security of our constituents and communities. As is known, this is a shared responsibility with local and state governments. I'm pleased to see this year's bill makes a significant investment in supporting public safety activities of those partners. I rise to call attention to the elimination of the Office of National Capital Region Coordination and to ask the committee's assistance in ensuring the Department not only maintain but demonstrably improve its collaboration with our local and state partners in the absence of this standalone office. I share the committee's concerns with the performance of the Regional Coordination Office, which according to multiple GAO reports has fallen considerably short of its goals. 2 natural disasters in 2011, a record snowstorm and an earthquake, showed that gaps in regional communication and coordination unfortunately still exist in the National Capital Region. During my time in the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors, I was a founding member of the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments Emergency Preparedness Council. The attack on the Pentagon in 9/11 revealed gaping holes in even basic communication between the federal government and regional partners. For example, following the attack, the federal government allowed early release of all of its workforce with zero coordination with local governments, thus creating some of the worst gridlock in the history of Washington, D.C. Thankfully, a proposal to also close Metro that day was rejected, or the situation would have been even worse. This is not just any region of the country. This is the nation's capital, and the number of federal assets throughout the region demands that the federal government play an active role in coordinating preparedness and response efforts with our local and state partners. In fact, Section 882 of the National Security Act of 2002 specifies the Department help assess, advocate for, and assist those state and local partners. I'd ask if the chairman of the committee, if it's his intent, the committee's intent, to hold the department responsible for fulfilling those functions without the standalone office, and if it's
Will the
appropriate,
gentleman yield?
I yield.
I thank you for yielding. Madam Speaker, I appreciate the gentleman's question. The committee has long expressed concerns with the operation of the National Capital Region Coordination Office, and numerous GAO audits have confirmed our concerns that the office has been underperforming its potential to improve regional preparedness coordination. I share the gentleman's desire to improve collaboration across the National Capital Region and with the federal government, and I know Administrator Fugate is committed to doing just that. I am confident that the coordination responsibilities outlined in Section 882 can be fulfilled within the reorganization under the Office of Administrator. Ranking Member Price and I are committed to making sure FEMA acts on the recommendations of the GAO to better meet with the requirements, and we will work to include you and other members of the Capital National Region delegation in that effort.
Will the gentleman further yield?
I would, and I thank the distinguished chairman.
I just want to echo the chairman on this point. We will work together and with you and with Administrator Fugate to ensure that FEMA meets its coordination responsibilities with regard to the National Capital Region.
I thank the distinguished chairman and the distinguished members of the staff, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. What purpose does the gentleman from Oklahoma rise?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word in order to enter into a colloquy with Chairman Carter.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As many people in this chamber and around the country know, Oklahoma has had a particularly devastating period of time, and I want to begin just by thanking my colleagues on both sides of the aisle and through them their constituents for their prayers and their sympathy and their help, because we certainly have received an extraordinary amount of help from American people, from the administration, and from my colleagues here in this chamber. While most people have focused on the damage in my hometown of Moore, we actually had, Mr. Chairman, 3 tornadic events. May the 19th, the towns of Shawnee and small communities of Kearney and Little Axe were hit. 2 people died, hundreds of homes destroyed, extensive damage. The second one was the next day, second episode, hitting the towns of Newcastle and Oklahoma City, in addition to my hometown of Moore, and that one cost the lives of 24 people. I'll talk about that in just a second. And then we had a third outbreak on May the 31st that hit El Reno, Oklahoma, and parts of Oklahoma City that are in my district. And this area actually spreads across several congressional districts. The first episode was largely in Mr. Langford's district, the second largely in mine, and the third actually hit Mr. Lucas's district, Mr. Langford's district, and my district. The single greatest loss of life, of course, was in my hometown of Moore, and so my colleagues understand the extent of the disaster. We not only had 24 dead, including 10 children, we had 33,000 people displaced in a town of 55,000. That is, they literally are not sleeping tonight where they were sleeping on the night of May the 19th. In addition, we lost 2 elementary schools, school administration building, extensive damage to 3 other schools, the hospital, the U.S. Post Office, hundreds and hundreds of businesses, so the employment base of the community was devastated as well. Full extent of the physical damage in this area alone is not yet known. The initial estimates by the Oklahoma Insurance Commission are somewhere between $2 and $4 billion, but it'll take a while to actually get through this. So I've spent a lot of the last few weeks visiting with, visiting with the people in the communities involved, particularly in Moore, but also in Little Axe and in Newcastle and Oklahoma City, the other areas. And without the tireless efforts of the first responders from all these communities and the surrounding area, we simply wouldn't have gotten through the horror of the experience. The communities in question are extraordinarily close-knit and sadly are quite experienced in this kind of activity. My hometown of Moore has actually been hit by 6 tornadoes in 15 years, including 2 F5s, the highest category. One of the tornadoes in question. This latest incident was actually the largest ever recorded, 2.5 miles across, and with wind funnel speeds of up to 295 miles an hour. So extraordinary to behold. As I understand it right now, as best we can estimate, there are no current needs for additional disaster funding. But the possibility, obviously, of other disasters and hurricanes, fires, earthquakes, and what have you, the rest of the fiscal year always raises the possibility that the resources that are available will be strained. And I want to make it very apparent that if that were to happen, I'll certainly be looking forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to make sure that should similar misfortune befall other areas, that they too have the help we need. If I may, I'd like to yield at this time to my friend, the gentleman from Texas, Chairman of the Homeland Security Subcommittee on Appropriations.
And I thank the gentleman for yielding, my good friend, Mr. Cole. The bill before us today builds on our actions of last year, includes robust funding for FEMA in the disaster relief category, funding that will most definitely assist those who lost so much in Oklahoma over the last few weeks. As of this morning, the Disaster Relief Fund currently has a balance of approximately $11 billion, which is sufficient to address the needs of Oklahoma and other recent disasters. As Oklahoma begins the road to recovery, I will continue to work with the gentleman to ensure that we're doing everything that we can to help the devastated communities, and our hearts go out to those folks. I yield back to my friend from Oklahoma.
I want to thank my friend from Texas who I had the opportunity to confer with during recent days for his kind support and assurances. You know, I know my friend would appreciate this. We sort of think of ourselves as Scotland to your England, and in football season, you know, I always remind people the Red River was an international border for 42 years, and every October it is again. But the reality is, when you're in a tough situation, you don't have any better neighbors in the world than our friends from Texas, and not just on this floor, but the outpouring, particularly from our neighboring state, in terms of volunteers and contributions, and honestly from all across America, has been extraordinary. Both the President...
Time of the gentleman has expired.
I thank the gentleman, and I yield back.
Who seeks time? Who's that from?
Illinois.
What purpose does the gentleman from Illinois rise?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to lend my support to the underlying bill we are debating today. The Homeland Security appropriations measures make key investments in technology for our first responders, disaster relief fundings for our communities, and critical grant funding for our local fire departments. It is the centerpiece for how we invest not only in our national security, but also in the security of our local communities. Earlier this year, the district I represent was severely affected by regional flooding that damaged hundreds of homes and businesses. The impacts on families is a human one. Many lost their homes, many lost their business, and may not be able to reopen. This terrible situation highlights the tremendous need for disaster relief that is comprehensive and far-reaching. FEMA helped many in my district to recover a small piece of their lives after the storms, and consequently, I am happy to see that the committee included $6.2 billion in disaster relief funding. This funding will be critical as we in Illinois continue the effort to rebuild our communities affected by the flooding, as well as for those in Oklahoma, New Jersey, and other areas as they rebuild after natural disasters. I also applaud efforts by the committee to support $1.5 billion allocated for FEMA state and local grant programs. Specifically, I would like to highlight a program that addresses the distinctive security needs of nonprofit groups, helping at the local level to safeguard human life and property against credible threats to the safety of our communities. The Urban Area Security Initiative provides a funding source for targeted nonprofit groups to invest in their own security. These grants, typically utilized by churches, synagogues, and community centers, are designed to acquire and install equipment that can help prevent and mitigate terrorist attacks in our communities. Organizers use these grants to make capital improvements, such as installing security cameras, physical barriers, or controlled entry systems, safeguards that can make a difference in deterring threats. Recent incidents in Boston, New York, Wisconsin, and New Jersey highlight the credible threats to these pillars of our communities exist. The need for these grants is clear, and the impact in our communities can be profound. I would like to thank the committee for its support of these critical programs that can be utilized by states and local groups to address emerging threats and security concerns specific to their circumstance. I appreciate the bipartisan work done on this important bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey rise?
Amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Garrett of New Jersey. At the end of the bill, before the short title, insert the following section. None of the funds made available by this act may be used by the Transportation Security Administration or a Visible Intermodal Protection and Response VIPR team to conduct a security screening other than pursuant to Section 44901 of Title 49 United States Code.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the TSA, it's not just for airports anymore. For years, the TSA has deployed Visible Intermodal Prevention and Response, or VIPR teams, to conduct literally thousands upon thousands of unannounced random sweeps of mass transit locations, ferry terminals, and highways across the country. And while VIPR teams can show up virtually anywhere at any time, these random searches are typically not in response to any specific threat whatsoever. And if you look into some of their team's actions, they demonstrate this is really not security, this is just security theater. For example, back in 2011, VIPR teams searched passengers on an Amtrak station in Georgia after the people had gotten off the trains, and obviously they served absolutely no purpose with regard to security whatsoever. And if you think that you can escape the TSA and keep some of your integrity intact by simply not going to the airport anymore, by taking a bus, a train, driving your car, well, you're sorely mistaken. VIPR teams now randomly are pulling cars and trucks off the road. They did it down in Tennessee highways, where they did a search, costing the drivers there countless hours and fuel as well. And VIPR teams conduct a similar operation to search vehicles leaving a port down in Brownsville, Texas. You see, the reach of the Transportation Security Administration, the TSA, has now expanded to such other areas and has even moved beyond transportation, has moved into sports stadiums as well. How do we know that? There was an article in, of no place else, the Huffington Post, where they reported back in January that the TSA was patrolling the Metrodome in Minnesota following a Viking-Packers game. And you have to ask yourself, to what end? A Los Angeles Times article revealed despite conducting thousands upon thousands of operations, quote, TSA officials say there is absolutely no proof that these roving VIPR teams have foiled any terrorist plots or thwarted any major threat to public safety. You see, Mr. Speaker, we cannot afford to continue to fund a program by its very own admission has absolutely no record whatsoever of preventing a threat to public safety. And that is why I am offering this amendment, to prevent funds from being made available to the VIPR teams to conduct searches outside of an airport. You know, as we come to the floor always, as good stewards of American taxpayers, Congress should not fund the expansion of TSA responsibility, especially when we know these operations are more appropriately handled by local law enforcement agencies at the various levels of government. This, I think, is truly a common sense approach. This is a common sense amendment and helps the TSA do its core function more efficiently and protect American air travelers. And thank you. I reserve.
Gentleman yields back his time. What purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
I rise in opposition.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to work with the gentleman on this issue, but I cannot accept this amendment. Following the 2004 Madrid train bombing and the 2005 London bombings that targeted civilians using public transportation, Visible Intermodal Prevention and Response, or VIPR teams, were developed to allow TSA to utilize federal, state, and local law enforcement to protect our nation's transportation system, including securing our surface transportation systems from the threat of terrorism. TSA Surface Transportation Security is responsible for assessing the risk of terrorist attacks for all non-aviation transportation modes. and the Viper teams, which are specifically authorized in the 9/11 Act, play an important role in protecting our nation's surface transportation systems. Simply put, the presence of these teams is intended to promote confidence in our nation's transport system by preventing terrorism to any mode of transportation, including surface transportation. Now is not the time to eliminate this important program, which serves to secure our surface transportation systems from acts of terrorism.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, I'll yield.
So I agree with the gentleman that we should add confidence to our travelers. But I would ask the gentleman from Texas, what confidence can we have in a program that by its own admission says they have not foiled a singular terrorist plot? By its own admission says that they are screening people after they get off the train instead of before they get on. By its own admission says that these programs are not mandatory, and that means that when you go to a rail station and you see them there, if you were a true terrorist, then you would say, I'm not going to go in that line, I'm going to go over in that line.
Reclaiming my time, let me say that I listened to what you said before, and you don't need to be repetitive. I understand your concerns, and quite honestly, they're valid concerns. And I will, as chairman of this committee, and with the assistance of Mr. Price, look into these arguments that you have made. Okay. But at this time, I cannot accept your amendment. And I don't need to hear the arguments a second time to accept your amendment. So I'm opposed to this amendment. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina rise?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last words.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I want to join the chairman in opposing this amendment. This amendment would prohibit any funding for being utilized by our mobile, visible, intermodal protection and response teams, the Viper teams. These teams provide the ability for TSA to randomly screen passengers on mass transit and in our airports. They also work in concert with state and local law enforcement agencies. They provide a surge capacity beyond the local capability in order to be able to respond to intelligence information and special situations. It's also important that exercises be conducted on a regular basis in order to test the concept of operations and develop the essential working relationship with local authorities. As the chairman indicated, in our assessments after the attacks in Madrid and London, it became clear that we lacked the capability, lacked the ability to rapidly respond to threats quickly and to react with a show of force against potential threats. That's precisely the purpose of these Viper teams. The concept was authorized specifically by Section 1303 of the 9/11 Act, a bill that passed this House with 371 votes. To eliminate, we will address these problems, as the chairman has indicated, problems that the gentleman has identified, problems that
would the gentleman yield on that point?
Addressed. Let me finish.
Yeah.
We will address the issues that you raise. You obviously have legitimate concerns, but none of what you've said, none of what the gentleman has said, is an argument for eliminating the funding, for removing an important deterrent capability. I'll be happy to yield.
I appreciate the fact that you would take a look at this. Would that this be the first time that I brought this bill to the floor and raised the egregious examples by the TSA in the past, I would hold some more weight to that, the fact that you would look at it. But this has been going on for years now. And to your point saying that we need them for specific, when there are specific threats, what TSA has told us is they're not doing this when there are specific threats. They're doing this when this is random. They're going into sports stadiums for no particular reason. They're going along highways for no particular reason. They're just stopping trucks for no particular reasons, not because of a specific threat, just because of random applications of it. If this was a situation where we said we know there was a known attack coming or something of that sort and you want to apply it there, that'd be one thing. But that's not what TSA does. They just go out. At this point in time, we are living in a country where if you want to travel, you can go to the airport and they can say you can't travel unless you go through a TSA. But if I want to visit my mom in Florida, they can go to the train stations and tell me I can't get on a train without going through TSA. And I can go to a bus station and they can say I can't go through a bus without going through TSA. And I can get into my car and they can tell me that I cannot go in a car without going through TSA. We have come to the point that I cannot travel in this country without some federal agency actually stopping me.
Well, reclaiming my time,
okay.
With all due respect, I believe the gentleman is exaggerating the kind of situation that ordinary travelers encounter. I also understand and hope he does that these Viper teams, if there's going to be the surge capacity, if they're going to be there to respond to specific intelligence information, then they're going to have to remain in operation. And there's certainly a warrant for random checks, for checking situations that may be problematic. I'm not saying there would never be abuses, never be intrusive behavior, but we need to correct that, not to come in with a meat axe and eliminate the funding. So I simply reiterate my opposition to the amendment and ask our colleagues to vote against it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Garrett. As many as are in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed will say no. Opinion of the Chair, the noes have it. The noes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I would ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey will be postponed. What purpose does the gentleman from Puerto Rico rise?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk that was printed in the congressional record.